Hello and welcome to the section on namespaces. Let's look at the section objective. After completing the section, you will be able to define namespace and sub namespaces. Namespace is really a very good concept that you should implement in your programming style. You should always make sure you separate your code and then you have an abstraction for your code so that it's reusable and you can easily embed in any other projects that you develop. Okay, namespace will give you such features wherein you can separate your logical code and you can have them separately as a library which you can include in any of the projects and then you can reuse them. Okay, so reusability is basically the main feature of namespaces. So in this section you're going to learn how to define a namespace, sub namespaces, and use them. You'll also understand how to work with namespace constants. So there are constants available. We'll see how to use them. Finally, work with exercise, interview question, resources, and practical test with the namespaces, which will help you to understand these concepts better. Okay, so let's jump into the namespace topic. Welcome to the lecture on namespaces. So if you open up the material folder, you can find namespaces. Open this up, go to example 1, define namespace. So we'll define a namespace and then we'll use them. If you open up this folder, you will find 2 files. Open that up. The logical flow is to understand how to declare a namespace and how to use it. So we'll declare a namespace and we'll use a namespace. For this, we'll create this file, define namespaces.php. Okay, so for this, we will create a folder in www as a namespace. So let's go ahead and create that folder. Okay, and we'll place all our files here. So we'll copy this file name. So Control N, Control S, we'll go to namespace folder and we'll save the file here. Okay, so let's define a namespace here. So before that, let's understand some definitions about namespaces. The namespaces are case insensitive. So remember that you can use namespaces in any case that you want and it doesn't really matter because it is case insensitive. Namespaces are used to avoid name collision between other libraries. As discussed, compare namespace are like folders, right? Let's say you have this www folder and then you created a namespace folder. Now your files are being organized based on the namespace folder. Similarly, if you have a code where you want to organize it based on name, right? Namespace have similar concept like folders, wherein you can create a file in the same directory, but you can give a namespace to it, a name to it, so that you can easily differentiate all the libraries and inside that namespace with that name. Okay, now if you want to access a file in a folder, you know you have to access within the folder and then the file, right? Similarly, if a namespace has been defined, you have to access namespace name first and / the actual constant. Right, namespace is a keyword used to define namespaces. So you will attach a namespace, a keyword to define a namespace. And there are a couple of things you can only define in a namespace. You cannot do variables in namespaces. You can only define classes, interfaces, functions, and constants. These are the only thing that you should define in a namespace. You should not define a variable and try to use that variable. It won't work. Okay. So organizing your classes, interface, function, and constants can be done with namespaces. And namespace, when you declare it, it should always be in the first line. If you declare in the 3rd or 4th line, then it will error out. Okay, so make sure you declare namespace as a first line. There is a keyword called include, which is used to include any file into another file. Okay, this we'll look into as an example. Then you'll understand how to use include keyword. Then you'll use the / to refer the subdirectories, like you have this backslashes. Similarly, you will have backslashes for namespaces to use. So you will understand this concept when we work around an example. But remember the key features like namespace are key sensitive. You can only define classes, interface, function, and constants. You have to define namespace in the first line. Okay, so let's try writing one namespace and then we will try to include them in the namespace here. So for that we will create one namespace file first, and I'll call it as namespace constants.php. okay, imagine this file is your library file, right? And you want to include this file into another file and then use all the constants that is defined in this file. Okay, so I created one more file. So let's define the namespace first. So we say namespace is a keyword to define namespace, right? So I'll say namespace and then I'll say my constants. Okay, then we say constants are allowed in the namespace, right? Then we'll define a constant and we'll say file underscore name. We'll give this namespace constants.php, and we'll also add an end of line to this. Okay, so it's pretty simple. We have defined a constant here, we have defined a constant in this namespace file, and we have named this namespace with a keyword called namespace. Okay, it's similar to how you name a folder. So for this ww we have created a folder called namespace. Similarly, if this file has to differentiate with other namespaces, you give a namespace name to it. And if you want to access the constant in that namespace, how you access a file inside a folder, you use the folder notation and then you access the file name. Similarly, if you want to access a constant, you use the namespace name first, then you'll access the constant. Okay, I'll show you how I'm going to use that. So let's go to define namespace. Now we'll try to include that namespace and then we will try to use that, print that constant. Okay, so to include, you can say include. Okay, we're going to include that namespace here, namespace constants.php. We have included that namespace here. Now once you include this namespace, you have access to this file name constant now. Okay, and how do you access that? Okay, so we'll say here include the namespace file, and how to access the namespace. So you can say my constants backslash file underscore name. Okay, let's run this. So if I'm in the ww folder, go to namespace folder, then you can run the define namespace. So if you see the namespace name, it's my constant, and you see the cap notations, and here the cap notation, it's all small and it's not all small here. So the reason behind is namespaces are case insensitive. You can use any name that you want. Okay, but the constant's name has to be same because the constant is identified with caps. So you put the file name here, and the value of that file name is a file name that we have attached here. That's why the file name has been printed. Okay, so it's a very simple concept. I'll do a just quick recap. When you create a namespace file, make sure you use the namespace keyword. Okay, you give a name to it. The name is similar to as you give a name to a folder. Okay, now whatever you can define inside this, you can access it via this name. Similarly, whatever you define inside a folder, you access it via a folder name, then you access the file name, right? And you can only define couple of things. You can define class, interface, functions, and constants, and anything else that you define in namespace will not be accessible. Okay, and remember the namespace has to be the first line. Let's do a try here. Okay, it will give an fatal error because namespace has to be the first line that you define in your namespace file. Okay, and now to include, you use the include keyword and give the file name, and once you include the file name, then the constants are available and you can access that constant with the namespace name. Okay, similarly how you use the folder name. Okay, I believe it's a very simple and easy concept to remember, and it's a really an important topic that you should include in your programming style as well. Okay, so that's our lecture on namespaces, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on defining sub namespaces. So if you go to example 2 in the namespace folder, you can find the logical flow and the deliverables. Logical flow is to define and learn sub namespaces, and this is the file we'll create define sub namespaces. So obviously we'll create some namespace file and then we'll include them in the define sub namespaces file. So let's quickly create this file. Let's save this file. Okay, I'll create two more files. I'll call it namespace constant 2.1. I'll create one more file and I'll call it 2.2. Okay, so I have two namespace files, and I'll include both of this namespace file in define sub namespaces, and we'll create sub namespace, means we'll create a folder inside a folder. So let's define a sub namespace. Namespace so we'll say namespace. Now you can say sub namespaces slash sub1. Okay, often at times you will find a situation wherein your sub namespaces has to be unique, but the inside the sub namespace you want to have as different small sections of namespaces. Okay, let's say a good example of this one is you will say, okay, you want to define some library called string, and inside the string you have to have a section on cleaning the strings. You want to have find, replace. So there will be cases wherein you are defining a namespaces, but you want to have sub namespaces just to have similar operations on the same namespace that you have. Well, that is the logical representation of how you want to organize your namespaces. It's just an example. Okay, you can choose to have one namespace and dump everything inside, or you can choose to have sub namespaces so that you organize your code into smaller logical units. Okay, so how you define it, you can use slash in these sub namespaces to differentiate between one namespace and another namespace. So this is basically a parent and this becomes a child. Okay, so we just define one constant here, and we'll still say the file name. We'll say sub1. Constants 2-1.php.phpol. Okay, so this is one namespace. You can copy paste in another namespace and you call it 2, and we can just change some text, and it is just a text, dummy text. It's a constant, and we'll try to access both of this namespace from the define sub namespaces, and we'll see how to call a constant from a sub namespace. Okay, so let's go to define constants. Okay, the first thing you have to do is you have to include those namespace files. Okay, so we'll include the namespace file, and then we will say include okay, so we have included the namespaces here, both the namespace file. Now how to access these sub namespaces? Okay, you can simply say sub. You can actually copy that over from here, okay, so that we don't make a mistake. You can say sub namespaces slash file underscore name. Okay, it's as simple as that. There's nothing fancy, it's just the slash notation will create a sub namespaces. Okay, and you can have n number of sub namespaces. You can have a slash b slash c slash x. Okay, n number of it, right? It's like a folder structure that you're creating. Okay, so let's execute this. We'll make it to 2 and it's 2 here. Okay, so you can run this sub namespace file and you can find sub1 and sub2. These are the constants name coming up from the sub namespaces. So these are the constant names that whatever you have given here is printed here. Okay, so this is the way you create a sub namespaces. You create a sub namespace, and then this is the way you actually access the constants from the sub namespaces. Okay, the most important thing that you have to remember is how do you create sub namespaces and how do you access them. Well, that all happens with the backslash, and using backslash you can create n number of sub namespaces. Well, that's all about sub namespaces, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on namespace constant. So let's understand how to use namespace constant. If you go to example 3, the logical flow is to learn how to use namespace constant, and part of it will create use namespace constant PHP file. So let's quickly create this file. Okay, so for this file we will reuse an existing file. We will reuse namespace constants.php. Okay, so we have this namespace already created, and then we will try to use it first. So I'm just copy pasting so that to save time. Okay, so we have this namespace my constants, and I'm saying my constants file name. So let's quickly run this, then we will add up the namespace constant in it. Okay, so we're able to print the namespace constants.php, that is the constant in the namespace file. So what is the purpose of having a namespace constant? Let's say you want to refer to the namespace name. Okay, there's a constant for it to refer to the namespace name. Okay, and once you do this, you actually get the namespace name here. Okay, you can add a slash here, and now you can access the namespace that's basically defined as a namespace. So you might be wondering why we need to use this. Okay, what is the purpose of having a constant where I can already know which namespace it is? The beauty of having a constant is basically, let's say in future you decided to change your namespace to _new, right? You don't have to worry about what namespace it is having. Okay, you're just referring the name here, and you don't have to worry what name it is. Imagine you are trying to hard code this somewhere in the down the program, then it's very difficult to change every line wherever you have hard coded it. So instead of hard coding, there's a way to access it, and once you change this, remember to change this in the file where you are accessing as well. Okay, so you see the new has already been referred back with the constant, so you don't have to worry about the constant's name. If a different programmer comes up and change this constant name, your program will not get break. Okay, the reason behind you're using a constant for it. It's a good practice. Always use constants and don't hard code any of the values in your program. Okay, well, that's all about namespace constant, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on defining namespace. So we'll do an exercise now to understand the concept better. So you should be able to do this exercise by yourself, but I'll show you it anyway. If you go to exercise 1, define namespace. So here is the logical flow. So you have to define a constant file using namespace, and use it into another PHP file. Okay, we have seen this as an example, but I want you to try it out. Then you use sub namespaces and namespace constants as well. Okay, so for the deliverables, we define a namespace exercise1.php. So let's create this file, and for the namespace, we will name it as my namespace.php. Well, you're free to choose whatever constants you want to define it here. You can define student constants like total subject, total marks, and passing marks, and then you can try to access them via the define namespace exercise1. So you can pause the video here and you can do the exercise on this defining a namespace constant and access them in the exercise file. You can take a reference of a student constant and you can have total subject, total marks, and passing marks, and try to access them in the define namespace exercise1.php file. Okay, you can pause the video here and do the exercise now. Welcome back. So let's do this exercise. So let's define our constants first. So first line should be your namespace. So I'll say student constants, and I'll say total subjects is 7, total marks is 700, passing marks is 200. Okay, let's access this in the define namespace. So let's include the file. So we can say total marks and you can say passing marks. Okay, so I've defined some constants here and I've defined my namespace name, and then I've used an include to include that file, and then I'm gonna print those constants. So let's run this. Okay, so I'm able to get access those values. We can enhance this to have sub namespaces. So I'll say student1, and I can access this sub namespace. Okay, and I'm able to access the students also. Okay, let's define one more constant, file underscore name, and we will use the namespace. Okay, so I've defined a file name here using a namespace constant. Okay, so let's try to access this file name. Okay, so able to get the namespace name and then the file name. Okay, so that's how you basically play around with namespace, how to use sub namespaces, how to use the namespace constants, how to define the constants, and how to include a namespace, and how to access the constants from the namespaces. Okay, so that's all on the exercise for defining namespace, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the assignment lecture on namespace. So if you go to namespace folder practical test, you have to create a config file and use it. That is your assignment for now. Define a config file with constants, okay, and name the constant file as config namespaces.php. Create some constants and then use the constants in the use namespace.php. Follow the instruction as it is given here so that you can verify whether the instructions has been followed and you are able to create this exercise or not. Okay, part of the deliverable, you can create two files, use namespaces.php and then config namespaces.php. okay, it's available in the namespace folder, practical test, and you can go ahead and try out this example. And it's a pretty simple. We have seen all these things: namespaces, namespace constant. Try to use all those concepts here and try to define a config namespaces with some constant and use them in the use namespace.php. Well, now you can go ahead and try out this assignment. Okay, so that's all on this lecture for assignments, and I'll see you in the next one. Well, that's the end of the section for namespaces. Let's do a quick summary on what you have learned so far. You should now be able to define namespaces and sub namespaces, include some constants in it, and you should be able to use those namespace in your program. You should also understand how to use namespace constants. And I believe you also work with exercises, resources, and practical test, which has helped you in understanding this concept better. Well, that's all for this section on namespaces, and I'll see you in the next one.